a cool beverage or a warm one to sip on as we talk today. I am Ashley Northington, and I'm the Vice Chair of Moving Forward. I am so delighted that each of you has decided to join us to discuss Metro Nashville's transportation and transit funding, exploring how our funding efforts and project implementation address issues of both mobility and equity throughout our city. Today, we have the distinct pleasure of hearing from Steve Bland, the Chief Executive Officer at WeGo Public Transit, and Faye DiMassimo, the Senior Advisor for Transportation and Infrastructure to Metro Nashville Mayor John Cooper. I cannot wait to hear what they'll share with us today. And again, thank you all for your continued engagement around transit and mobility solutions for the Middle Tennessee region. We could not do this work and move our region forward without all of you. Now, without further ado, let's hear from both Steve and Faye. First, we'll hear from Steve, and then we'll come to Faye. We'll stop at around 9:05 for questions. So please do, as we move along, put your questions in the chat, and I'll be sure to ask them at the appropriate time. Steve, take us away.
Thank you, Ashley, and good morning, everyone. I'm going to put up some slides just to give some perspective on some of the things I'll chat about, and I think it'll dovetail nicely with what Faye has to share with you. I'm going to move through quickly through an overview of transit funding for WeGo Public Transit, including the pending Metro operating budget and the impacts of the 3 federal COVID relief bills that passed through Congress over the last year and a half, and overlay that information with some pending service upgrades and as well as some capital projects. This particular slide gives you kind of a historical perspective on our funding with Metro. Historically, Metro's provided regular increases in funding that allowed transit service expansion from the early 2010s through 2018. With tightening budgets after that point, funding has been flat, and during the past year, operating funds were cut by 44% due to the impacts of the pandemic and Metro's structural budget issue. Of course, this was done recognizing that we could pick up the slack to a large extent due to the availability of federal CARES Act funding. For FY 21-22, we've submitted a funding request to Metro for $51.6 million to get us back to the baseline level shown on the green part of the bar, as well as a $3.2 million supplement to kick off what we call our Better Bus Service Expansion Program that's included in the city's transportation plan adopted in December of 2020. Of course, any discussion of the financial condition of transit, really anywhere in the nation, has to include the unprecedented infusion of federal funds into the transit program to mitigate the harm that could have come to transit riders in the absence of these funds through the pandemic. Among the 3 specific COVID relief packages, regional transit operators in Middle Tennessee recognized total funding of just under $124 million through 2 of them. The middle package, the CRISA package, we did not receive any funding through. Focusing specifically on the MTA, we were allocated just over $101 million of this amount. And to date, we've allocated about half these funds toward extraordinary operating expenses created by the pandemic, capital projects targeted at improved system resilience, offsets to reduced operating income like passenger fares, parking revenue, what have you, as well as last year's funding cut from Metro's budget. That leaves us with about $56 million in unallocated funds from the 2 measures. Directionally, the single largest factor in how we will program these funds will be based on the outcome of this year's Metro operating budget process, and I'll touch on the alternatives in the next few slides. If Metro is not in a position to restore all or most of the reduced operating funds from last year, of course, we'll need to focus most of these resources on sustaining the current system until Metro is in a position to at least get us back to baseline. Now, I mentioned we requested an increase of $3.2 million from Metro above our baseline to begin implementing the Better Bus recommendations included in the city transportation plan. Unlike most elements of the city's plan, that are heavily oriented toward capital projects, roadway improvements, sidewalks, and the like, the core of public transportation is in service and therefore in the operating budget. When fully implemented, Better Bus improvements will expand current service hours by 30% and touch almost every current WeGo public transit route, as well as creating several new service options. From an equity standpoint, these improvements will particularly expand access to opportunity for the current rider base that tends to be employed in lower wage positions in the service sector. Hours of service would expand to a 21-hour service day on key routes. Service frequency would be upgraded with a particular focus on midday, evening, and weekend service. And there'd be a number of extension of current routes and several new crosstown and circulator connections. This service expansion would be phased in over a 5-year period to allow for strategic sequencing to maximize our opportunities for success, as well as to complete several necessary precursor capital projects, such as fleet expansion and the completion of key stop and transit center improvement projects. Frankly, the sequencing would also allow us to do incremental staffing increase, as the overall service improvement would require about 105 additional bus operators to our staff. Giving the equity lens color in a different way, I'll use this illustration as to the impact of what we're looking at in Better Bus. This specific location focuses on our planned transit center in North Nashville at 26th Avenue North and Clarksville Pike. If we're able to fill out the Better Bus network, it'll expand the number of jobs accessible within a 45-minute average commute of the people in this neighborhood, which tends to have some of the lowest auto ownership characteristics in the entire region, by over 100,000. So on this map, the green areas are locations they have access to within 45 minutes now on average. The blue is what that expanded coverage would be under the Better Bus scenario. Given our experience with varying levels of ridership loss during the pandemic, we're jump-starting work on Better Bus by reordering it and moving some of the Better Bus planned service initiatives up into our core system that had previously been desired but held pending funding, and moving other services down from the core system into services that would be desired if we can afford to fund them. Essentially, we're building on the core frequent service network of 9 routes that carry over 70% of our ridership, improving frequency and span on these routes, as well as other high ridership local services. In this particular chart, that frequent service network is color-coded in red, and some of the other key local routes are the purple numbers on this particular chart. This follows our 2019 service restructuring, where we eliminated a number of duplicative or underperforming routes. Now, in contrast with the route elimination of 2019, reduced and discontinued services on this list are services we would absolutely want to operate, that had a level of utility and a level of productivity that's desirable. But frankly, at this moment in time, they just aren't the highest priority. And I would highlight on the discontinued service lists, the 4 light blue routes. Those are heavily oriented toward our office commuters. And until we see a significant return of the office employee base into downtown Nashville, frankly, they are not the most productive of our services. Another equity element of our Better Bus plan is the concept of mobility on demand that you've heard me talk about before. We're currently partnering with Uber to beta test what we're calling the WeGo Link system in Antioch. Essentially, using an Uber voucher, people who are within an 8-square-mile area in Antioch can get a discounted ride on Uber to connect to one of 2 stations on our Murfreesboro Pike bus route, which essentially would bring down the overall cost of that commute in areas where it's not particularly efficient to run public transportation. And yet another element of Better Bus that impacts the equity concern is a concept that is called fare capping. With our quick ticket touchless fare payment system that's currently in operation, we're using mobile payment and contactless smart cards as payment options. This system's capable of adopting fare capping. And the way fare capping would work is typically we offer high volume products such as monthly passes that give significant discounts to frequent riders. The caveat is that most folks on limited incomes can't afford the upfront cost of the passes. With the quick ticket system, if they open an account, they can load denominations really in any amount onto their account, and they're automatically upgraded to whatever the best value product is for them, whether that be day pass pricing, monthly pass pricing, what have you. Then quickly turning attention over to the capital spending plan, funding trends from Metro somewhat followed the trend of the operating budget, with significant investments made through fiscal year 2018 and curtailment as Metro encountered budget challenges over the past few years. In this year's capital spending plan, beyond the minimum amount we need to match available state and federal grants to sustain the core system, $2 million has been committed to stop upgrades as well as to advance work on some of the neighborhood transit centers. I would hasten to add, however, and I believe it's a point that Faye is going to make, that several of the other categories of investment in the capital spending plan can benefit transit riders, including investments in sidewalks, investments in the traffic management system, and a particular project we're excited about working with Faye and others in Metro on is the downtown neighborhood traffic study. Of course, in the coming years, we're going to need to see the trend improve even to sustain the current system, let alone implement the projects included in the city transportation plan. This chart illustrates that we'll need about $20 million annually to sustain the system in a state of good repair, with a primary focus on timely fleet replacement. City transportation plan items in the early years focus on stop improvements, transit centers, and advance work on larger scale projects such as Murfreesboro Pike Bus Rapid Transit and major upgrades to the WeGo Star commuter rail line. Prior investments through the CSP have led to recent and ongoing projects such as you see here that include the Murfreesboro Pike Signal and Stop Improvement Project, our Nolensville Stop Improvement Project, which is currently in its final stages, replacement of passenger coaches on the WeGo commuter rail line, upgrades to the Mount Juliet station, as well as support for transit-oriented development that's occurring around that station, and advancements of the first in what we hope will be a series of neighborhood and regional transit centers, including one that we've just started construction on in Green Hills, adjacent to the new Hillsborough High School. This is a partnership with Metro Nashville Public Schools, and one currently in design in North Nashville, as I mentioned earlier, at the intersection of Clarksville Pike and 26th Avenue North. So I'll just conclude and wrap up by saying I'm looking forward to Faye's comments. It's been super exciting for us to work with her and staff over at Metro Public Works Planning on the city's transportation plan. It's truly multimodal in nature, and we're especially anxious to begin building out the Better Bus program as resources become available. So with that, I will turn it over back to you, Ashley.
Thank you so much. Thank you for sharing. Now let's turn it over to Faye DiMassimo, who no doubt will give us a lot of great info. Again, attendees, please do ask your questions in the chat box. When we stop at around 9:05-ish, I will ask them for you. So please do put your questions in chat. Faye, take us away.
All right, good morning, everyone. Great to be here with Steve. That wonderful introduction about transit. I know Steve mentioned it several times over the course of his presentation, but the partnership between Metro Nashville and WeGo MTA, RTA right now is just, I think, exceptional. And we're very pleased with how much we're accomplishing and, more importantly, how much we're going to accomplish. So next slide. So what I wanted to do in these first few slides is just refresh us all a little bit on the Metro Nashville Transportation Plan. That was endorsed by council, approved by council back in December, which in some ways seems like years ago, but not that long ago. So, and to sort of put it in context, from just since the time that that adoption action was completed to what has been accomplished now. So just again, setting that foundation, a multimodal system for all that offers choice and better connects neighborhoods, residents, and businesses to the place that they need and want to go in a safe manner. Super important, and notice that System for All is a really strong part of our equity commitment. And I know you heard Steve mention that, and we're going to talk a little bit more about some of the other tools that we are bringing to the table to accomplish that. Next slide. So you also probably recall that the Metro Nashville Transportation Plan project list, and you'll see I know most of you, I'm sure, have a copy of the plan or have accessibility to it online on the city's website. So these references to additional information on several of the slides, you can go and dig into more detail there if you'd like. But it was roughly about half transit, about half what we call traffic multimodal safety, sort of two portfolios that came together to create this multimodal system, and about half and half. Again, these were based on, you recall, we did 11 community listening sessions and about 36 stakeholder listening sessions throughout Metro Nashville. We were fortunate that those 11 community listening sessions were accomplished prior to COVID descending upon us. And so we were able to have all those in person, and I think a very robust environment of engagement. But what we told people when we went to those first meetings is we're not here to tell you, here's the plan. What do you think? We said, what do you think? And we had a series of exercises that people were able to offer up what their perspectives are on what our transportation system should look like. And transit, sidewalks, state of good repair were the top vote getters nearly universally across all 11 of those community listening sessions that covered all of Metro, and were mirrored strongly in all of the stakeholder listening sessions as well. And we said, when we come back out with a plan, you're going to be able to see your input reflected in what we put forward. And you'll note that the strongest levels of investment in the plan are behind transit, sidewalks, state of good repair, even while we're understanding that in a multimodal system, we've also got to have healthy investment in other components like traffic management as an example, to make sure that the system performs and supports transit as well as all of the other portfolio elements. Next slide. I'm not going to go too much into this other than to say Better Bus was a key component. I know Steve's already talked about this in detail. Next slide. Also, new and upgraded WeGo Public Transit shelters. One of the things that we heard throughout our public outreach process was in some of the areas where current shelters or a lack of shelter at a stop was a real impediment, certainly to the dignity of our transit patrons. And again, this is an equity consideration in addition to just a system upgrade. Next slide. So you can see the various levels of investment. I mentioned that earlier, and how all of those things come together to produce this multimodal plan. I'll talk a little bit about two of the projects in particular today, a little later in the slide presentation, the Jefferson Street CAP multimodal connector, as well as the downtown neighborhood traffic project, which were most of the elements in the transportation plan were of levels of investment in particular project types. These are two very unique, distinctive projects that were called out in the plan that will accomplish some particular aims of creating this multimodal system. Next slide. Some additional notes we wanted to be sure that we called out was the regional and state coordination through GNRC and TDOT. Both were strong partners in the development of our transportation plan. There's an entire appendix section devoted to our identification of regional collaboration opportunities in the Improve Act, as well as the regional transportation plan, how we can what we're doing can best partner with interloop study and some of the other key components that TDOT is working on right now. And that downtown neighborhood traffic project is really a particularly key element of that. And then of course, a lot of conversation going on about Amtrak right now. And we've been in conversations with Amtrak now for a year, coordination with them for a year on some of the things that we're all hearing about now with the administration being so supportive of passenger rail service. Downtown Nashville has its own particular uniqueness and a lot of uniqueness for a lot of unique needs for how we need to build out the system, particularly around traffic management, how we can support the Better Bus programming, how some of these key corridor efforts, like for example, the Murfreesboro BRT, there are things that we've got to do in the downtown to better manage all of our traffic from that core out, so that all of those projects can be successful. And the downtown neighborhood traffic project, which just got funded, $1 million study that's going to be starting up very soon, is going to be key to that effort. Affordable housing strategy. You'll note that we included 2% of the funding for the projects in the transit corridors, the high capacity transit corridors that are noted in the plan. 2% of that project funding is dedicated to affordable housing along those corridors. And in addition, we're working on other efforts that are more metro-wide around that as well. Next slide. So you probably also know, so the transportation plan passed in December, and one of the recommendations in the transportation plan was a Department of Mobility and Infrastructure, or Department of Transportation. And certainly that is not a new idea. It's something that's been talked about here in the past, but we're getting it implemented. So just this past week, council took action on a memorandum of understanding that was needed to realign some of the functions that are currently within Public Works that are not transportation to other departments, so that the remaining elements that are left there are the transportation components. The organizational structure for this new Department of Transportation had already been created and reviewed by the mayor. And we are now already actively engaged in the process of working with the employees who are there in terms of how that realignment, everyone no one is affected in a negative way. There may be opportunities for people who want to explore some career paths that might not have otherwise been available to do so, but just making sure that that alignment of all the existing human resource into the new organizational structure, getting that accomplished, as well as beginning to recruit for some of the key positions, national talent search for a director, as well as some other leadership positions that that either some people will be assuming, or we may be looking for some folks based upon some recent departures from the department and so forth. So what will this Department of Transportation accomplish? Improved focus and accountability of resourcing, better aligning the structures, the processes, the skills, roles, systems, and tools. I won't go, if anybody wants me to, I can, but I won't necessarily go into all of the gory details right now of some of the things that we've been working on, but they're really important tools that we didn't have. A pre-construction management manual, a construction management manual, a processes and sort of procedures manual for engagement with consultants and contractors. There's just some key management tools that we didn't have available that we've been working on, in addition to a critical evaluation of our sidewalk program. Our sidewalks tend to be one of the areas where we get critique about that they cost. The cost is higher than most of our peers, and the delivery times are they're just unacceptable. And so we've been working to examine what are the root causes of those things. TDOT actually helped us out with part of that peer review, as well as some of our peers in Tennessee and in the surrounding sort of Southeast market. And we've identified some areas for quality improvements, and we are also moving forward with implementing those. Ongoing improvements to A&E contracts, utility coordination. I just talked about the sidewalk program evaluation and the construction management manual. So there's a lot of sort of, back office, behind the scenes, but absolutely critical things that are needed in order to move forward with this DOT. And we made the recommendations to the mayor, as well as these operational excellence improvements. We said we would deliver those by the end of 2020. We did that. And of course, council recently took an action on that. Next slide. Metro Nashville's transportation plan. As we talk about funding, you recall that because of the situation that Metro had, both with the structural need in the budget, as well as the resulting tax increase, and then the pandemic and the economic impacts of that, we did not believe that this immediate time frame was the right time frame to pursue a dedicated funding approach. Obviously, dedicated funding is an advantageous place to be. It is not something that is off the table. It's still something, as you can see, that we show that we would be pursuing. But currently we're pursuing this opportunistic funding strategy, and we've been exceptionally successful with it. And we'll talk about that a little bit more, but just to lay out again, sort of what the plans are for how our immediate, intermediate, and mid-long-term plans are for funding the transportation plan, and how that's being coordinated with the capital improvements budget and the CSP are all important things. Next slide. This is just the planning or the funding toolbox for transportation efforts. We know that there's a lot of tools in the toolkit. We made sure to evaluate hundreds of these and then curate it down to about 72 that were available to us in Tennessee under state law, under Metro Code, and were the kinds of things that we knew matched with the projects that are in the plan. So we were very thoughtful and deliberate about how we crafted this toolbox that we're now relying upon to execute in this opportunistic funding environment that we are in for the short term, near term. Next slide. Again, this just sort of lays out the activities that we are, both the consideration of the DOT, but this marries back to the what we're going to do to the how we're going to do it and fund it that we just talked about. Next slide. So current activities, there's a Coord, C-O-O-R-D, is a company that's a digital curbside management company that is doing a smart loading and unloading pilot in our downtown right now. We hope to have the results of that soon, and we'll be able to incorporate that into the smart parking efforts that council also recently approved that we'll be moving forward with. That smart parking effort is designated for the 1,700 or so metered parking spaces, coin metered parking spaces that we have right in the core of the downtown. This does not deal with our residential parking or any of that. We're focusing on that first in an effort to both understand the market here around what are the kinds of technology deployments that are smartest and best for us, and then also understand what are the best ways to operate and manage what we have, with the eye towards a future complete operational analysis of all parking, including residential parking, and how we integrate all that into a curbside infrastructure management plan. So the transportation plan passed in December, and in January, we were awarded a $3 million project, Charlotte Avenue Smart Corridor Design. This is a project that improves both or offers the opportunity for more with technology for more reliable transit operations, as well as better traffic management in that corridor that also improves safety and can improve flow and just reliability of service. The Vision Zero action plan is underway, and we have been undertaking lighting improvements in partnership with NES and TDOT, particularly in those areas where we have seen pedestrian fatalities on some of the major corridors, the pikes, and in areas where we see a lot of pedestrian activity. I've already mentioned the business process improvements and the capital spending and CIB funding alignment. So upcoming project initiatives. The Downtown Neighborhood Traffic Project is a project that just we found out was funded this past week. This is a partnership between Metro, WeGo, the Downtown Partnership, and TDOT. All are funding partners. And what, again, I described earlier, what we're going to be doing is looking at all of the activity of traffic, and don't think of traffic as cars. Think of traffic as buses, people on their feet, the scooters, the entertainment vehicles, the delivery vehicles, everything that's happening that composes some sort of transportation movement in the downtown, and in particular related to traffic management and transit operations. How do we really sort that out and manage that and complete that in the downtown so that that core can best serve all of the other system improvements that we'd like to make? The North Nashville Transit Station is also an active project that I think Steve mentioned. And then the I-40 cap proposal, the Jefferson Street cap, we currently have a grant application in. That project was a project, it was the single largest project that was included in the transportation plan. So it was offered out there in the sort of public space for public comment and so forth through all of those listening sessions that we did, through the publication of our plan and so forth. It was one that we suggested all along. It's one that's been discussed all along. Very interesting history with this project is when I-40 cut through the Jefferson Street neighborhood and caused such destruction. There was at that time, actually, back in the early 60s, and Lyndon Baines Johnson sent the Federal Highway Administrator to Nashville to negotiate an agreement to put a cap there to heal some of the divide that was created in the community. And by that time, there had already been a Supreme Court case over the impacts to the community. There was a lot of distrust, and the cap never came to be. So we fast forward to more recent times, and the Ladders of Opportunity Design Challenge that was that the federal government hosted a few years back, probably I think it's been about 5, 6, 7 years ago now. We participated in that to again initiate conversation around this project and the desire for it. That was followed up with some work that was done by the Nashville Civic Design Center in terms of looking at what the caps, and in fact, there were several caps in that area. So we put forward that same proposal as a part of the transportation plan and the comments on it. And what we've done is we have purposefully not designed the projects, and beyond the public outreach that has been done both as a part of the grant proposal and then as a part of the transportation plan, we have purposefully not started yet to engage any further community work. And here's the reason why. We want to be sure that when we go back to the community that we've got the resources to do something, and that we do what they want done. We do what the community, what the North Nashville community wants done. So we've got this application in. It's a $120 million project. We will find out in June if it has been funded. It's considered a very strong application, I understand, very much in line with the administration's desires around equity, around climate and sustainability, around economic justice, and so forth. So it's a very strong proposal. If it is funded, our first action will be to work with the community for the community to design the project. And we are working now on just what that whole process of how we'll start back out to the community to talk about that. So exciting project, got our fingers crossed. We also applied for the Bloomberg Mayor's Challenge. And what we did was we chose to focus on pedestrian safety, which we know has reached, our pedestrian fatalities are just unacceptable. And the mayor, both through the Vision Zero program, as well as through this Bloomberg Mayor's Challenge application, has committed to that as a priority. And we also are choosing to use the Equity by Design tool that was developed and included in our transportation plan as a way to further develop that tool targeted to the pedestrian safety space. And that's what our Bloomberg Mayor's Challenge application is all about. And then lastly, we've got upcoming, there'll be a call for CMAQ, congestion mitigation air quality funding by the state over the next few months. And it's a great funding source for the Traffic Management Center. You've heard us talk a bit today about how important traffic management is of all kinds of traffic. Traffic management is the workhorse of any transportation system. So it governs your signal system and all of the associated infrastructure with it, governs how cars and trucks and transit vehicles move through a system, how pedestrians cross, how bikes move through. It does all of those things. And so it's important that it operate efficiently and effectively, and so important that it be modernized so that we are engaging in a smart signal system, and we have a nerve center to operate that from. We've already got the location identified in the Howard building, and a particular area that's already partially built out for this purpose. But that CMAQ grant would enable us to fully build it out, as well as to go ahead and make improvements along some of the key corridors to go along with it. And I think that's something that TDOT is super interested in. Next slide. So that's the end of my presentation. I saw that there were questions popping up around the cap and some other things. So I'll turn it back over to Ashley to field the questions to us. Thank you all.
Thank you so much, Faye, for taking the time to share all of that wonderful information. I know I have a few questions myself, but I'm going to let the attendees ask theirs. So I see that there's a couple that have been asked and answered already, but I'm going to repeat them so that just in case people who aren't paying attention to the chat have an opportunity to hear the question and the answer. So the first one is about the partnership with Uber, and it is, Steve, was Lyft not willing to meet WeGo's terms for the new WeGo access service using Uber?
Sure, and appreciate the question, Richard. Yeah, we tried to work with both Uber and Lyft, and I wouldn't say so much it's that Lyft wasn't willing, it's that Uber has a much more evolved program that they do around the country, because we approach it as kind of a user-side subsidy. It's not sort of an either or. So if at some point in time that Lyft would like to engage, or frankly, any of the other TNCs that are out there would like to engage, we would have an open invitation out for that for sure. Some of the specific issues we had to work through with Uber, the trickier ones were data sharing, as everyone I think is aware, as well as some of the indemnification and liability issues. But I would call it an open invitation to really anybody in that space to participate. We're in beta test now, so we're trying to make sure it works correctly, and it's a pretty seamless experience from a user perspective.
Perfect. And Steve, this one is for you also. Is there a way to access the WeGo Link program without a smartphone? So this is considering those folks who maybe aren't tech savvy or are older, because I know someone like my grandmother would have her eyes crossed trying to figure that out.
Right. Absolutely. Folks without access to credit card, smartphone, or any of the things that kind of are a precursor to using some of the TNCs can work through our customer care department to book rides, as well as Uber's concierge service to do that. And the other part that wasn't in the question that's a key important piece is we've also lined up some of our subcontractors in our access program, that if there's a need for a wheelchair accessible vehicle that Uber doesn't have in their capabilities, that we're able to provide wheelchair accessible service.
And so this next question, I think this one might be more for you, Faye. And it says, can there be a little deport dice into the current and planned transit-oriented developers and types of amenities and associated building using technology? And also, how will those incentivize equity?
I think that's probably a Steve and I both question, but I would say that, the planning department is currently working in terms of how our current land use regulations and so forth help to support transit-oriented development. There's certainly a strong interest in that. And Steve and I, as a matter of fact, just had a good conversation yesterday with some groups that are interested in that, around what does transit-oriented development mean in Metro Nashville, without a fixed guideway system per se, but with a very rich transit environment in certain areas that are in need of those kinds of opportunities. So I think it's a collaboration between planning department, transit, mayor's office, and then our affordable housing folks, Barnes Fund and so forth, in terms of how, and MDHA, in terms of how we all come together and deliver that. But there's a lot of work going on around that now. Steve, did you have any more to add to that, particular to the transit-oriented development piece?
I think it really covers it well. It's an alignment of all the various resources and players that are involved in it. I think what makes Nashville different, so if you've been exposed to or involved in other cities, you'll know that transit agencies are very involved in this in places like Seattle, Atlanta, and Denver. But where that's typically happening is, Faye mentioned fixed guideway systems, where they actually have land that they're developing around stations. And here we don't really have that. WeGo doesn't own a lot of property other than our bus garages. So, our real participation is just trying to collaborate, whether it's with the development community, with various metro codes and development departments, what have you, to try to, make sure we align resources, for lack of a better word.
Sure, good. This next question is, why is there no plan to utilize the Cumberland River for transit by ferry boats? It can connect many residential areas directly to downtown, and it can be integrated with WeGo's plan.
I'll take a shot at that first, and then Steve can add his thoughts to that. But I would say this: it's a matter of resourcing, and right now what we're doing is committing resources to those things that can offer us the greatest impact. That is the greatest carrying capacity, if you want to call it that, and the greatest cost benefit. how much are we able to move people more effectively, get them to where they need and want to go, with, you know, the most efficient and effective way. And while that clearly could serve a need, as talked about, that the capacity of that's probably not huge. And right now we're trying to really make the most bang for the buck in the moment. I wouldn't say that that's off the table at all for future. I would just say it's not probably one of the highest priority investments right now when we're trying to solve sort of really fundamental connection issues. But Steve, you have anything more to add to that?
I agree with that. I think the only thing I would add is when we developed the long range regional transit plan through the N-Motion process back in 2016, we were kind of following the lead of the city's comprehensive plan at that time, Nashville Next. And what Nashville Next identified was that most development, and particularly transit-oriented development, would occur during along the radial arterials along the city, not specifically, you know, kind of along the river. But to Faye's point, there could be future opportunities for that. And one of the studies we'll be participating in coming up that's getting a lot of attention right now is the East Bank study. Absolutely. You know, and what might happen on the east side of the river to make that more possible. Right now, as of today, there really aren't a lot of concentrations of development right on the river, you know, other than downtown, say the foot of Broadway. So you're really having to link a whole bunch of, you know, have to get on a bus, to get off, to get on a boat, to cross the river, to get on another bus. So, you know, that supportive land use isn't there right now.
Yep, makes sense. So the next question, I'm going to combine two of them. And it is, when will the community have an opportunity to learn more about the Jefferson Street CAP? And will the community have an opportunity to help design that specific project?
The community is going to design the project. So, and that's going to be a very exciting thing. As a matter of fact, in the grant application itself, we specifically proposed it clearly that way, and that's why we're coming without a shovel-ready project. We're coming with the need that this is very different, and if we're really going to accomplish the aims of reconnecting that community and improving the area from a, you know, pedestrian activity, from the usable space, and so forth, and try to give back what was taken away, then that's really got to be community led. And so it made all the sense in the world to go into this with a minimal amount of the environmental and other kind of work done and not have proceeded into design. So as soon as we know more about the project itself, in terms of the community learning more about it, it's available in the transportation plan in its description. But in terms of learning more about the details of the project, the community will lead the design, and we don't want to go back to the community until we have funding, because otherwise, I think everybody's a little tired of hearing about studies and plans. They
Yep.
want to know what we're going to do. And so we want to wait until we have the resources to know that we can implement, and then go to the community and say, we're ready and we can do something. What do you want to do?
Got it. Got it. This next question is for you, Faye, and it is, how will the transportation planning functions currently located in the planning department be integrated into the new Department of Mobility and Infrastructure?
Well, those transportation planning functions that are currently located in the planning department are going to be realigned to the new DOT. And I think that that's going to be a real key effort for us. I won't tell you some of our stories, but we clearly have some stories where we can show that having so many of the transportation functions spread out different places, we have absolutely had things fall through the cracks, or the handoffs not occur very effectively or smoothly in terms of information and development, or grants being applied for that, you know, that the engineering staff didn't get a chance to see, and that had real issues with them. I mean, like I said, I could sit and tell you story after story, but those transportation planning functions that are currently located in the planning department are going to move to the Department of Transportation and be conducted there as a part of a overall development of and delivery of our transportation system here in Metro Nashville.
Mm-hmm. The next question, it says, you've stated that the goal is to connect neighborhoods to transit. However, there are neighborhoods in North Nashville that have been waiting on sidewalks for years to link them to Clarksville Highway, and yet other neighborhoods have sidewalks being torn out and replaced. What is the plan to get people safely to bus stops?
So I know you know in the transportation plan that that was one of the largest commitments to implementation was in the sidewalk program. We are currently working through a backlog. It's a year's worth of backlog of funding in implementing sidewalks. As I said, I mean, I was going to be honest with you. Our sidewalk delivery system is in many respects ineffective right now. And that's not a reflection on the good folks at Public Works. It's just a reflection of just a lack of leadership around that effort, both in terms of assessing the problems that we've had in the sidewalk program from a cost and delivery perspective, and resolving those root causes, which we have done now, and then beginning to get that backlog of both funding and project commitments, some of which are in this area, moving out and moving forward. So I think we're certainly entering into peak construction season. The commitments have been made around the manpower resourcing, the contract resourcing, and we've identified all those backlog of projects. And so you should start to see over this coming months and into summer and fall with our peak construction season, you should start to see some of those projects being accomplished. If there's a particular project that you're interested in, if you would email me after this meeting, I can go and run that one to ground specifically where it is in the system right now and give you a more specific time frame of when you would likely see it or when it will be programmed to come up if it's not already programmed.
Perfect. Okay. The next question is there a project in particular that could be pointed to that would be emblematic of transit success here in Nashville?
Man, that's a tough one. Because I guess it means, how do you define success? I would tell you, and this is just a personal perspective, so I want to say if any MTA or RTA board members are on the line, this does not necessarily represent the views of either board. One of the reasons I'm really excited about working with Faye on the downtown neighborhood traffic plan is it's going to be very difficult for us to get a foothold, particularly in the commuter market, when we're talking about trying to mitigate congestion without better access of transit through downtown. When state employees were the dominant worker in downtown Nashville and all of our regional commute services oriented toward our central facility at 5th and MLK, that makes perfect sense. State workers are declining in real terms, and they're certainly declining as a percentage of the downtown workforce. So we've got to be able to make better connections from our regional services to Sobro, to West End, what have you. And frankly, when we've got folks tied up in traffic with those connections, it just makes it very difficult to make those inroads. So I think that would be the real game changer of a project. And the irony is it's probably going to be one of the least expensive projects that we could contemplate, but that does not reflect necessarily the position of either board.
Got it. Let me get down here. There are lots of good questions. Steve, this one is for you. What are the current WeGo ridership numbers, and what is ridership forecasted to be in the next 5, 10, 15, 20 years?
I can go past and I can go present. When I start getting further out than next week, I'm probably on thin ice. So our typical ridership pre-pandemic was about 32,000 passengers per day. We bottomed out in the heart of the pandemic at about 9,000, came pretty quickly back to 12. We reduced service to about 78%. Last week, we're at about 16,000 riders a day. This week, we added more service. So we went from 78%, now we're at 90%. We expect to return to at least full service in the fall, hopefully more if we get better bus funded. So we're actually kind of satisfied with as people kind of slowly return, as folks get vaccinated. I don't need to get back to 30,000 next week. I'd like to see us, basically our financial projections are kind of relying on about a 2-year return to normal. And I think the future beyond that, 5, 10, 20 years out, depend on a lot of things. What kind of progress can we make with some of the system improvements? What can we see in the affordable housing realm, that Faye's talking about? What might we see with some of the transit priority measures? So, a lot of that, what might we see with greater employer participation? Now with quick ticket and mobile payment and all that, we really want to ramp up employer passes, which tends to be underrepresented. We'd love to work with the chamber and moving forward on that. So there's a lot of questions to answer with regard, but, I'm expecting that we should be back to, I won't say new normal, but pretty close to where we were within the next couple of years.
Thanks. So Faye, this next question is for you, and I'm combining 2 questions again. And that is, what do you envision is the timeline for the downtown neighborhood traffic projects? And now that it's fully funded, when will the public begin to hear about next steps?
So our internal team kickoff meeting is tomorrow.
Oh, wow.
So after tomorrow, we should have, but I would expect that the public would begin to hear about next steps, because the public and the stakeholder component of this is, Steve's heard me say this before, this is much more about that as it is about the technical piece. But it's about getting community alignment of residents, businesses, and other participants in the downtown transportation infrastructure world together in some measure of consensus and agreement around how we prioritize the activities that are happening there. So I would expect that we would have a schedule after we have our, like I said, our team sort of internal get together and begin to kick off. I would expect that by summer, the beginning of summer, so this is now April, so May, June, I would expect by June there should start to be some public activity around the conduct of this and carrying it forward.
Okay. Does the lighting improvement with NES include lighting around the bus stops located inside of neighborhoods?
Where we focused the lighting improvements that we just recently completed, and I should recall the number because it was quite a number of lighting improvements with NES and TDOT, was around the areas where we've seen the pedestrian fatalities or pedestrian conflict issues in particular. Some of those were associated with transit areas as well. But if there's a particular area that the questioner is interested in and would like for us to check, if they'll email Steve and I about that, then we'll follow up on that.
Wonderful. Okay, folks, we've got 2 more questions. And if you guys haven't seen Eric Hoke's comments, please check them out. He's got some opinions about what should be happening. So the next question is regarding the Jefferson Street cap. Has the Department of Transportation, the United States Department of Transportation, indicated what land uses, if any, may not be permitted above the roadway?
Sure. I mean, it's not much has changed at Federal Highway since the time I was there, and that was like decades ago. And you can't have commercial uses or for-profit uses on top. So, I would say that we know that off the top of our head is not going to be a component, but there are certainly many other types of activities and opportunities that can exist there. And again, we'll have to see what the community wants it to be.
Wonderful. Okay, and this is the last question I think that I'll ask. But before I do that, please, Steve and Faye, when you get a moment, put your email addresses in the chat so that folks can follow up with you all to ask you those specific questions about sidewalks and other projects that you guys can look at specifically. So the last question is, with the transportation plan and CSP approved, what lies immediately ahead for transit in Nashville? How can residents help make positive impacts or help support these projects in progress? And what does WeGo and or the city need from advocates like Jessica Dolphin and the good folks at the Transit Alliance for Middle Tennessee?
I'm going to start this one and then let Steve wrap it up, if that's okay.
That's
So one of the conversations that I actually have had with some members of this group recently was, I know when the last CSP, capital CSP commitment came out, that, you know, there was some concern around what was viewed as a lesser level of investment in transit. And Steve mentioned this early in the conversation. There's a very purposeful way that we're approaching this, and it makes all the sense in the world from a transportation system perspective, but perhaps in a public realm, it doesn't make as much sense. So transit will not be successful if we don't have good roads for it to roll on. Transit will not be successful if we don't have a good sidewalk so that people can get to the transit. Transit won't be as successful if we don't have a good traffic management system that enables it, as well as the other kinds of transportation movement that's occurring in our system, to occur effectively. So you saw in this last CSP on capital, that's where our strong commitments were in those kinds of projects. And very purposeful, and a lesser level of commitment to shelters and so forth. I think that future CSPs, you're going to see that shift to get back over to, on the capital side, to get back over to the capital needs. But then Steve will, I'm sure, comment on the fact that transit really is stronger, or is the support of transit is really in that operational side, where the greatest need is. And I know Steve's made a really strong, and many of you in this group have offered letters of support, has made a really strong request for not only restoration of funding, but the additional funding needed to get Better Bus moving. And I think those enjoys my full support. Of course, the budget process, the operating budget process is still in play, but I think continuing to talk to your council members, continuing to talk to the mayor, you know, continuing to express those points of view, and to know that, you know, at least as in my role as senior advisor, I'm continuing to advocate for that as well. That's kind of how the process is moving forward now. Steve, you want to add to that?
Sure. First of all, I think, particularly on the capital side, a lot of projects are longer lead time. So kind of a good news, bad news thing. A lot of the things that were funded over the years, you're going to really start to see pop out of the ground over the next 6 months to a year. I mentioned the Hillsborough Green Hills. I know Ed Cole's on this call, and Ed was instrumental in working with us down with the Green Hills Neighborhood Association on getting that off the ground. It's under construction now. It'll be open in the fall. And when it opens, our plan is in the fall to extend the 12th Avenue South bus to meet up with the Hillsborough bus down there. Mentioning Clarksville Pike Transit Center, and talking about a community engaged design process. So we have a design team on board now. We've done early engagement with some community leadership, and that's going to continue over the next several months. And our intent is to kind of work through design this year and get into bidding and starting construction next year on that project. Stop and shelter projects continue to move at pace. Again, this week we started ramping back up service. We'll finish ramping back up in the fall. Quick ticket coming online. Everybody who's been asking me to pay with your phone, you can now pay with your phone. So we're anxious to roll that out. Bringing on board a new marketing director. Many of you who knew Jason Mincer, who relocated, will miss Jason. But what I said to her was, you'll have an opportunity to basically reintroduce the system to people as we get into the fall, and you know, we're all sort of coming back out. And then, of course, what was funded in this year's CSP was stop improvements. So a focus for us will continue to be, you know, upgrading individual stops, particularly with a focus on those high boarding locations that really need to be upgraded. Nolensville Pike project is filling out. The major stations down at the Walmart on Harding Pike are getting close to completion. We expect them to be done within about the next month. We're working with Faye and Councilman Sledge and the Fair Board on the fairgrounds development, what we might do with stations around there. So there are a lot of good things in the pipeline, but I will close with a cautionary tale for advocates. I whipped through things very quickly, and one of the things I think was probably most noteworthy in the slides I showed was, as of this moment, we have $56 million of uncommitted federal money that could be put toward projects. And there will be a temptation. I'm not saying whether it be an intention, but there would be a temptation for our traditional funders to say, hey, you've got access to that money. You don't really need us right now. But if we're able to get back to our baseline, I'm talking about city, state, you name it. If we're able to get back to our baseline, that frees up an awful lot of room for projects in the transportation plan, transit centers, more stop upgrades, what have you. And the cautionary tale is, obviously, whatever might happen with the Metro budget, but also in this year's governor's budget, TDOT, because of the availability, not because of a deliberate intention to short transit, but because of the availability of substitute funding from the feds, cut transit funding by 21% statewide. So that will limit our ability to go after project money from TDOT, which was extremely instrumental in funding out the North Nashville Transit Center project. So that's sort of the cautionary tale. I think folks like the Transit Alliance, Transit Now Nashville, moving forward, have done an outstanding job of keeping a spotlight on this, but there's no time to let up now.
Got it. Perfect. Thank you so much, Faye and Steve, for sharing with us and for sticking around to answer so many questions. Thank you guys for your willingness to be here. And thank you to everyone who tuned in and remained engaged with moving forward as we follow Metro's progress and transit and mobility funding and how these projects connect Nashvillians to jobs, education, amenities, and other life enhancements. This work is super important, and I'm so glad that each of you all are committed to moving forward. Goodbye for now.
Thank you.